Chapter 1. The Iron Moon That Forgot to Die. There are places the galaxy forgets on purpose. Not by error or accident, but by ritual, by decree. Vorax Moon was one of them. A jagged, hollow world caught in the dying orbit of a collapsed gas giant. It had no breathable atmosphere, no functional trade routes, and no place in any official star chart. But the pirates knew of it. The scavengers, the grave robbers, the cults that whispered to the dark between stars, they all knew. And none of them dared land. Because Vorax Moon wasn't simply dead. It was watching. At its equator, rising from a black glass crater, stood the spire, an impossible monolith etched with symbols that moved when you weren't looking. A spire that hummed with heat, even though it cast no shadow. A spire that pulled at minds and memories the way gravity pulls at time. And inside it, for 300 years, was her. Not a prisoner, not exactly. A keeper, perhaps. A relic. A curse. They called her the Bound One, though no name remained on the walls. And her voice, though silenced by chains of impossible metal, echoed in the dreams of those who passed too close. She knelt inside the spire, never aging, never sleeping, surrounded by links of a material that predates even the builders of the first gate. And her chains? They had resisted lasers, particle disruptors, black hole resonance. Even the claws of a dying god hadn't torn them. Because they weren't merely physical, they were linguistic, spiritual, coded into the DNA of her imprisonment. And for 3 centuries, not a single blade, not even a whisper of weapon, could break them. Not until a man with a rusted sword came down from the sky. Cale had never believed in legends. He was a man born in the scrapyards of Romagellan, where stories were currency and dreams were taxed like sin. His parents were repairmen, his siblings mechanics and welders, and by the age of 10, he could reassemble a jump core from scavenged pulse circuitry with nothing but a broken cutter and a mouth full of curse words. The outer worlds were unkind, and kindness was a currency no one used anymore. He hadn't gone to school. He hadn't served in any war. But the sword had found him. Wrapped in a burial cloth beneath the wreckage of a downed Imperial freighter, rusted through, its edge dull as bone. He'd almost thrown it out, thinking it junk. But something had spoken. Not aloud, not even in words, just presence. And from that day on, he dreamed. Always the same dream. A tower beneath a cracked red sky. A woman with iron coiled around her bones. And the sound clearer with each passing night of chains snapping like thunder. Her eyes would open just before he woke. And she would mouth a single phrase. Come late, but come. He tried to forget. Changed ships. Changed systems. Even visited a memory-wiped planet once. But nothing worked. The dreams grew louder, more real. And then one night, as he drifted in orbit over the collapsed trade world of Velsarin, the coordinates appeared on his console. Unbidden, unmistakable. Vorax Moon. The approach nearly killed him. The storms that circled Vorax sky made normal navigation impossible, a constant swirl of dust, static, and warborne debris. But Cale wasn't a trained pilot. He was a survivor. He flew on instinct, duct-taped his ship through electromagnetic shear waves, and landed hard in a valley where glass, sand met stone. The tower was visible even before he breached atmosphere, its presence a black needle thrust into the eye of the stars. The closer he got, the quieter the world became. The static faded. The hum of the engines dulled. Even his thoughts seemed slower, weightier, as if time itself refused to intrude on the monument. And then he reached the gate. It was not made of metal, nor stone, but something that flickered between both. There were no panels, no locks, just a handprint. Old, faded, burned into the center of the archway as though left by something that was both alive and dying. He placed his palm against it without thinking, and the gate sighed. The air inside was thin and dry, tasting faintly of iron and dust. The chamber was lit not by artificial bulbs or bioluminescent roots, but by something older. Symbols floated in the air, glyphs that shifted like fish beneath ice, flickering above every stone. The walls were covered in patterns that pulsed with light. Not randomly, but in rhythm, like a heartbeat. And at the end of the hall, down a staircase carved from obsidian and woven metal, was a circular chamber, domed, vast, and utterly silent. She knelt at its center, not bound in the traditional sense, not manacled or caged, but enmeshed, her body threaded through with chains that pulsed with language. They were alive, in a way that couldn't be explained, twisting slowly around her arms, her ribs, her legs, vanishing into the ground like roots drinking pain. She wore no armor, no robes, just a simple cloth tattered, ancient draped around her shoulders. Her hair hung like smoke, thick and silver. Her face was calm, and her eyes, they were open. "You came," she said. Kale couldn't speak. His throat had closed. His lungs felt too small. But she smiled. A slow thing. Bitter. Beautiful. Like starlight breaking on ice. "I dreamed you," she said, "for centuries." He stepped closer. The sword in his hand buzzed not with energy, but with recognition. The chains around her hissed, pulled tighter, like wounded animals feeling heat for the first time in centuries. She didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded toward the blade. "It remembers," she whispered. "They thought it lost. They buried it in ruin and blood and forgetting. But it came to you. A blade unmade. And a man unchosen. Perfect." He didn't understand. But he didn't need to. He raised the sword. The chain screamed. Not with sound, but with pressure. The air thickened. The symbols around the dome flared. And the floor cracked beneath his feet. Runes burst from her body like sparks. But he brought the blade down in a single, clean arc. There was no clang. No clash. Just a shudder through reality itself, as if some unwritten rule had been violated so violently that the universe didn't know how to respond. The chains shattered. They fell away like water, like scales, like illusions collapsing under the weight of something real. They did not break as metal does. They ceased, gone before they hit the floor. And she rose, slowly, carefully, as if she were unsure her bones still knew how to stand. Then she looked at him, and the dome sang. It wasn't music. It wasn't voice. But the walls vibrated with something that felt like emotion, joy, grief, warning. And in that moment, Kale realized the truth. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was the lock. And now, the gate had opened. Kale did not speak as she stood fully upright, her height nearly matching his, her presence far outstripping it. She was no longer bound. But something about her posture suggested restraint still clung to her like the ghost of weight never truly lifted. She turned her wrist slowly, as if reacquainting herself with the motion of freedom. Her breath was slow, deeper now, resonant like wind rising through the ribs of a ruined cathedral. The walls around them shimmered. Glyphs changed hue, cycling from pale blue to the crimson of dying stars. She blinked only once, not at the shift in color, but at Kale himself. The blade in his hand no longer hummed. It had dulled again, quieted, the rust clinging to it like dried blood returned. But something had changed, not in the blade, but in the air, in the foundation of the chamber itself. "They will come," she said without warning. Her voice had shed its exile and now carried the calm certainty of a queen, or a prophet, or something older. Kale finally found his voice. "Who?" he asked. She looked beyond him, through the spire's unseen walls. The ones who forged the chains. The ones who fed on fear and time. The gate I kept shut was never theirs to own, but once it broke, they began digging toward it. They will smell this act. They will know I am free. Kale sheathed the sword across his back, the weight of it oddly comforting, like a hand resting on his shoulder. "Then we leave," he said. But she shook her head. "We cannot. Not yet. The spire must be sealed again from the inside. And now that the chains are broken, only I can do it, but not alone. The blade broke the spell, but to seal it will require a choice. And a witness." Her gaze held his, searching not for understanding, but for endurance. "You came here with no name on your lips, no kingdom in your shadow. That makes you clean. That makes you able." Kale wasn't sure what she meant, but already the chamber trembled. The glyphs faded, and far above, the howling of the void outside grew louder, as if Vorik's moon had taken a breath for the first time in millennia and was deciding whether to scream or sing. They ascended the spire together, step by step, through corridors long abandoned to silence and reverence. The walls bore no dust, no rot, only lines, concentric and sharp, that bent at impossible angles and shimmered when Kale brushed against them. The woman moved with grace but no urgency, as though every moment that passed was exactly where it needed to be. Kale, for his part, stayed quiet. He wanted to ask her name, but something about the stillness made him hesitate. She had been chained for 3 centuries and did not speak of hate. She bore no madness in her eyes, no tremor in her steps. She was not broken. She was waiting. When they reached the platform that opened to the moonscape, the silence cracked not with words, but with memory. Cale saw it first, black figures on the horizon. Not ships, not machines. Shapes with form but no face, cloaked in massless armor, gliding toward the spire as if swimming through the airless dust. The chain forged, she whispered. Remnants of the sentence. They will try to bind what was unbound. They do not know how to stop. Cale reached for the sword, but she placed a hand on his arm. Steel is not the answer. Not yet. She led him to the crown of the spire, a chamber shaped like a lens, open to the stars. At its center was a dais of obsidian petals, closed like a flower in morning. This is the seal, she said. It opens only once every turning of the dark star beneath us, and only with a truth spoken freely. She turned to him, face soft but unwavering. You must bear witness to what I am, and then you must decide whether to close the gate forever or leave it open, knowing what may pass through. Cale frowned. What are you? She looked to the stars. A bridge. A lock. A weapon made to guard a door to the other sky, the place where thought becomes flesh, and flesh becomes gods. The chains kept it shut, but I am still its key. She stepped onto the dais. The petals shifted. Light spiraled around her feet, forming symbols Cale could not read, but understood all the same. If you seal it, she said, I will never leave this place again. I will become the lock, and you will become the final line in the story. Cale took a breath. He stepped forward. I dreamed of you, he said, voice rough. Not as a warrior, not as a weapon, but as a question. He looked around the chamber. And I think the galaxy has too many locks and not enough answers. He drew the sword again, not in anger, but in offering. So I choose to leave the gate open, but not unguarded. She looked at him, and for the first time smiled without sorrow. The seal did not rise. It bowed, and the stars blinked in reply. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Never Slept. The stars above Vorik's moon had changed. Cale didn't notice it at first, not consciously. But as the days passed, if they were days at all, he found himself staring longer at the sky, noticing patterns that hadn't been there before. New constellations. Dimmer shades of red in stars that once burned blue. It was as if the universe itself had shifted by a fraction of a breath, like an orchestra pausing to tune their instruments before the next movement began. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, remained within the spire. She didn't sleep, nor did she eat. She wandered its halls with her hands brushing the ancient walls, coaxing light from dead circuits and reawakened glyphs from stone. She spoke only when necessary, and when she did, it was with the weight of someone translating thoughts that had never been meant for mortal tongues. Cale stayed, not because she asked, not because of duty, but because something had taken root in him when that blade broke the chain, something he couldn't name. He repaired his ship out of habit, reinforced its shielding, even installed a second pilot interface, as if preparing for company he didn't yet understand. But he didn't leave. Every morning, he walked the perimeter of the crater, watching for shadows that didn't belong, and every night, he returned to the spire. The sword remained at his back. It no longer rusted. It no longer slept. And in the hours when he stood alone at the edge of that obsidian plateau, he sometimes thought he could hear it breathing. She revealed her name on the 13th day, not in ceremony, not in confidence, but as an echo. They stood beside the sealed gate, where the petals of obsidian still pulsed softly with restrained power. I was called Orenai, she said, touching the structure. Once, before the chains, before the silence. It is not my name anymore, but it is the only word that ever fit. Cale repeated it quietly, Orenai, and it felt like the unlocking of another door. She turned to him with eyes that shimmered not with light, but with memory. You carry a piece of the first rust, she said. Do you know what that means? He shook his head. It means you are a fracture in the story the galaxy has been trying to write for a long time. It means you can choose paths that were erased from maps long before your kind even learned to look up. He didn't answer. There was no answer. Only the weight of her truth. The spire was not merely a prison. It was a scar. A wound stitched shut with ritual and forgetfulness, and now, open again, it bled possibility. The chain forged returned on the 21st day. Cale saw them first through the telescope he mounted on a collapsed watchtower at the crater's edge, dark figures rippling through the magnetic dust, silhouettes wrapped in gravity-null metal that bent light and truth alike. A dozen, maybe more. He warned Orenai. She nodded. They will not attack unless I step outside the boundary of the gate's song. As long as I remain here, they will watch. They are waiting for command. Kale paced. He hated waiting. But she didn't. She simply returned to her quiet work, as if their presence meant nothing. What are they waiting for? He asked. Permission, she replied. From the ones who gave them form. That night, Kale slept beside the spire's outer ring, sword resting beside his chest, and dreamed of screaming metal and rivers of liquid geometry twisting through stars like veins. On the 30th day, the Chain-Forged sent an envoy. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't even a voice. It was a cube, no larger than a fist, carried on a platform of levitating crystal, covered in runes Kale couldn't decipher. Orenai approached it cautiously, placing one hand upon it. Her eyes dimmed. Her voice dropped. They want to speak, she said. Not in words. In memory. The cube opened, and Kale was pulled in. It wasn't a vision. It wasn't a message. It was a memory not his own of fire across galaxies, of a war fought in languages unspoken by flesh, of the forging of the chains not from hate, but fear. They had bound Orenai not because she was evil, but because she refused. Refused to let them pass. Refused to let them unmake what had been born without their blessing. They showed him the gate from the other side, an expanse of screaming color and formless hunger pressing against the veil of matter. And then, at its center, a single voice, hers. Not Orenai's, but something beyond her. Older, larger, watching through her eyes. The warden. Kale awoke gasping, hands gripping the stone beneath him like a drowning man pulling free from the deep. They know now, Orenai said, standing beside him, that you are not afraid. He didn't answer. He couldn't, because he was. But he stayed, because she did, and the stars continued changing. Kale had always believed himself to be small, a man built not for fate, but for fixing broken things others had discarded. And yet here, on a moon that time had exiled and the stars had forgotten, he had become a fault line in the great silence, a man whose rusted blade had cleaved through 3 centuries of binding, whose presence alone kept the unmaking at bay. Orenai did not treat him like a savior. She treated him as an equal, as though she recognized the tremors in his hands, the heaviness in his breath, and did not flinch from them. The days stretched like ghost ribbon across the lunar sky, time no longer ticking in minutes, but in echoes of the past bleeding into the now, of the chain-forged watching from the black horizon with their soulless faces turned always inward, as if listening to some command Kale could never hear. The sword remained silent too, resting against the spire's wall like a loyal hound awaiting its master's next burden. Orenai spoke little, but when she did, her voice struck like stone dropped in a still pond. They will try again, she said once. But not as ghosts. They will send the living. Kale didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He only looked up toward the thinning stars, the growing noise in the air, and knew the silence was nearing its end. On the 55th day, a ship came. Not one of the old gods. Not the chain-forged. But something worse, curious humans. Explorers. Corporate scouts. Scientists in armor with ideas about salvage, about containment, about forgotten assets. They landed half a kilometer from the spire and made no contact. But they deployed drones. And they began to dig. That was when Orenai finally looked afraid. Chapter 3. The Rusted Blade Remembers. They didn't come with weapons at first. They came with scanners and drills, with sterilized suits and predictive AI protocols designed to assess anomalous phenomena in the name of progress. They set up camp with lights that stabbed into the dust and tents whose walls pulsed with artificial atmospheres. Their insignia read Halicon Systems, a name Kale recognized as one of the Terran Annex conglomerate's dig arms, which meant they weren't here by accident. Someone had found the story. Someone had bought the coordinates. Kale and Orenai watched from the ridge, the spire rising behind them like a silent verdict. Will they listen? Kale asked. Orenai's voice was quiet. They never do. He nodded once and went back to the ship to ready the sword. He tried to speak to them on the 3rd day. Walked alone across the rock plain with his hands raised, without armor, without defiance. A young man greeted him, a survey lead named Deverick, who smiled with practiced diplomacy and asked him what level of containment was being enforced in the spire. Kale said it was not a ruin, that it was not abandoned. that they were not welcome. Deverick responded by assigning 2 guards to follow him back, to map the terrain, and to test how far a man would go to protect a myth. They never reached the spire. They turned back without instruction, without warning, with expressions blank as silence. The Chainforged had not moved, but they had made their presence known. And Halicon, to its credit, did not press further, until the excavation team struck resonance. They found something beneath the surface, a structure coiled like circuitry and humming with frequencies that had no entry in Terran archives. A signal, not from Vorik's moon. From beneath it, Kale felt it before the seismic tremors. The sword trembled. Orenai stopped moving, eyes wide not in awe, but memory. That, she said, is not for them. Then she was running. She moved like thought. Down the crater, across the plain, into the teeth of the excavation zone, where humans barely had time to react before the air itself bent. The spire's pulse had reached the ruins below and something had answered. The gate had not opened, but something had knocked. Kale followed without thinking. He drew the blade. It sang. And all across the camp, machines died, power flickered, and every drone fell from the sky as if struck from existence by silence sharpened to a point. The blade sang not with music, but with memory, a resonance that cracked the air, bent gravity, and made even the dust retreat in reverence. It wasn't loud, yet every living thing in the camp turned toward it, instinct overriding training, ancient fear eclipsing curiosity. The Halicon team scattered as the humming deepened. Their automated exosuits failed, their logic systems choked on paradoxes encoded in the frequencies that poured from the blade, and their drones, once a swarm of quiet purpose now, shattered mid-air as if insulted by the song. Kill didn't chase them. He walked. Slow, deliberate, eyes locked on the seismic node at the center of the dig where the first crack had opened. It wasn't just a breach in stone, it was a mouth. Not teeth, not bone, but shape and silence, unfolding like something that remembered movement. And from its throat poured light. Not brightness, not radiance, but a color Kale had no name for. Something that tasted like memory and bled into the cracks of perception like a lie made flesh. Orenai stood at the edge of the breach, hands raised, mouth open, whispering words not in any known tongue. Phrases the spire echoed back, distorted, layered, reverent. And then the ground shifted. The Chainforged, silent for so long, began to move. Not to fight. To kneel. Every figure, once a still silhouette against the crater wall, folded down in unison. Their heads bowed, their forms flickering. Not submission. Recognition. They knew what the light meant, what her release meant. And Kale finally understood he had not freed her. He had unlocked her. She was not the last warden. She was the first. Orenai stepped into the breach, and the light embraced her. It did not burn. It did not blind. It recognized her as its child, or perhaps its mother, and wrapped around her like cloth woven from truth. She floated not by force, but by invitation into the wound in the world. Kale followed. The sword in his hand no longer felt like metal. It felt like history, like burden made manifest, a thing with its own pulse, its own breath. The passage beneath Vorik was vast. A cathedral carved in the bone of the moon, filled with statues that shimmered and whispered across realities. They passed glyphs that moved to avoid being read, structures that folded inward to guard their meaning. And at the heart of it, a machine. No gears, no wires, just an entity suspended in place, wrapped in chains of light, bound with purpose. The origin gate. Orenai turned to Kale. This is where the first decision was made. This is where my oath began. They built it not to destroy, but to contain something that wanted too much. And when the builders died, I remained. Because I remembered. She placed her hand on the machine. Now it stirs. Because you remembered. Kale looked around, overwhelmed. Why me, he asked. Why now? Orenai closed her eyes. Because someone always forgets to lock the last door. And someone else always comes to close it. But you. She looked at him again. You held a blade that broke the lock. Which means you must choose whether we open it again. The machine groaned. Not with sound. With will. It wanted to be asked. And Kale did not run. He raised the sword. Not to strike. But to name. The machine pulsed once. Then waited. Kale whispered the word he had never spoken before. The name he had not known he carried. Truth. And the origin gate opened its eye. Chapter 4. The door that chose us. The moment the origin gate opened, the universe did not roar or rupture, it inhaled. All sound, all vibration, all motion ceased as if the laws of physics had leaned forward to listen. The great eye at the center of the machine did not blink or glow, it simply was, a depthless circle of unmade space through which no color passed and no light returned. Kale stood still at its edge, sword lowered, Orenai beside him with her hand pressed gently against his shoulder, not guiding, but reminding. They were no longer bound by time, as others measured it. Around them, the chamber moved in impossible ways, stairs unfolding from nowhere, walkways arcing into reflections, gravity curving gently around invisible shapes. Kale saw not one world through the eye of the gate, but many versions of Vorik, versions of Orenai, versions of himself. Some had fallen, some had burned, some had never awakened. Each one pulsed with a truth, and each truth pulled at him like a tide. Orenai's voice was calm in the flood of vision. What you see is not prophecy. It is possibility. All of them want to be true. All of them already are. The gate does not show futures. It shows doors. And one of them, only one, must now be chosen. Kale tightened his grip on the sword, which no longer felt like a weapon at all, but like a key he was not sure he was meant to hold. And if I choose wrong? He asked. Orenai turned toward him, her gaze neither fearful nor commanding. Then we try again, and again, and again, until the path you walk becomes the one worth walking. He looked back into the abyss and saw a version of himself, alone, old, waiting beside a rusted spire buried in sand. He turned away. That would not be his door. The possibilities did not tempt him with glory. They whispered in quieter tones worlds where he walked away, where the blade never found him, where Orenai remained chained, and he lived a quiet life among salvage and smoke. They were seductive not because they offered power, but because they offered peace. But peace bought by silence, by forgetting, by abandonment, was it peace at all? Orenai said nothing more. She waited. The gate pulsed. And then Kale stepped forward. He closed his eyes, and he chose. He chose the door where the stars burned brighter, not because they were young, but because they had been saved. The chamber rippled like heat over metal. The eye of the machine narrowed, then vanished, and for a moment Kale thought nothing had changed until he looked up and saw the chain-forged standing in rows around the dais, weapons lowered, heads bowed. The gate had not been sealed. It had not been destroyed. It had been reprogrammed. It would not open without a new name. And that name was now his. Orenai stepped down from the platform, the glow of the chamber dimming behind her. She looked no different, still tall, still timeless, still bearing the weight of memory. But Kale saw the shift in her shoulders, the release in her eyes. The burden was shared now, not ended, but carried. Together they walked back to the spire, not as jailer and key, not as prisoner and blade, but as survivors who had chosen not to let the old war begin again. The Halicon expedition had long since gone. Their camp abandoned, half melted by residual energy, notes scorched and scattered, their final logs filled with images they could not interpret and readings they dared not trust. Some would say Vorik was cursed. Others would mark it as a zone of anomaly and never return. That suited Kale fine. He had no desire to explain what had happened or what was coming. The spire would remain. The gate would slumber. And he would wait, not for battle, not for prophecy, but for the next soul brave or foolish enough to wield a sword that should have rusted into legend. And when they came, as they always did, he would be ready. The years passed, though Vorik's moon never changed. The spire stood unchanged in its solemn vigilance, surrounded by black sand and drifting silence. Yet within, life persisted. Kale had built more than a home there, he had built a rhythm. Each day began with maintenance and meditation, followed by quiet readings from forgotten books retrieved from scattered ships and stations, and often concluded in the gate chamber itself, where Orenai would pace the petals of the dais in silence or speak to him of things no history preserved. The chain-forged remained, not as sentries, but as watchers no longer bound by command, but drawn to the weight of the gate's hum, as if even their artificial cores found peace in the presence of stillness. Pilgrims came, some in search of miracles, some in search of death, and most seeking answers the stars had never given them. Few were turned away, none left unchanged. They would climb the stone ridge, stare into the great black face of the spire, and meet Kale, who carried the sword not as a banner, but as a tool, the rusted symbol of a door opened by accident and guarded by choice. Sometimes, Oranai would speak to the travelers, and her words would stitch new meaning into the broken maps they carried. Other times, she would only listen. And when the wind died, the two of them would stand in silence and remember what had once almost broken the world. There came a time when the gate pulsed again, not in warning, but in invitation. Kale knew what it meant before Oranai did. The spire's lights dimmed to a deeper hue, not one of danger, but passage. A cycle had ended. A new door had opened, not within the machine, but within him. He sat at the foot of the dais, blade across his knees, and looked up at Oranai with the calm of a man who had no regret left to bury. "It's time," he said simply. She nodded. No tears. No ceremony. Just understanding. "The gate will remember you," she said. "Even if no one else does." Kale chuckled softly. "I'd rather they forget. Let them remember the silence instead." She walked with him to the chamber where the rust first sang, and when he stepped into the core where the petals curled inward and the light formed a single, unbroken ring, he did not vanish. He was simply not there anymore. No flash, no scream, no monument. The sword remained behind, propped gently against the wall. Years passed again. Generations. The spire remained. And one day, a child came barefoot, curious, and unburdened by history. She touched the sword and asked, "Who left this here?" Oranai smiled for the first time in decades. The man who answered a question the galaxy had stopped asking. The child tilted her head. What was the question? Oranai turned toward the open sky, and the stars pulsed like memory. "Why not me?" And the story began again.